In this video, we will talk about constructing a situation model according to the construction integration theory of reading comprehension. The construction of a situation model is what this theory posits happens in our minds while we're reading a text in order to understand it. So what we should be paying attention to, and what the point of this is not the superficial aspects of the notation, but it is to take this as an idea about what happens in the mind as you go through a text. The construction integration theory posits that certain steps take place in the reader's mind. And because different readers may have different interpretations of the same text, perhaps because of differences in background knowledge, or perhaps because of differences in how they draw inferences, in their ability to draw inferences, or in the resources to draw inferences about. This means that different readers can have somewhat different interpretations of the same text, that is, construct different situation models based on the same text. This means that no one specific situation model is the absolutely correct one based on a given text, because the situation model is the result of a contribution from the reader to the processing of the text. So what I'm going to present is not the absolute truth in any sense, but is just one way in which might approach the example text that we will work with. Of course, there are some basic ideas and some basic elements that must be present, and which, if absent, indicate that the text is not understood. The usefulness of the construction integration model is that lack of understanding can be precisely described in terms of the steps required in the construction of the text base and the integration of the situation model afterwards. So specific comprehension failures can be theorized to be due to specific failures in some or many of these steps. I would also like to note that I will be following the notation and conventions as they are presented in the textbook by Schwanenflugel and Flanagan. And you may see differences if you read about the construction integration model elsewhere. There are some variations and different degrees of simplification in the different presentations, but the general ideas should be the same. So what is the mind supposed to do when you encounter and read a text like this, and you have mastered decoding to a sufficient extent that you have no trouble recognizing the words in these sentences? Let's see how the mind goes about processing them with the aim of understanding. The first sentence starts with talking about a little boy. So the first thing we must represent as we begin to read this sentence is that a boy is involved. This is a person, and so it's likely to be of particular significance. We'll see below. And this boy is a little boy. So the first thing we do is we represent the noun, that this is an entity that is being talked about in the text. And then there is some attribute of this entity that is associated. So 1 is the number of this proposition. So we're setting out a list of propositions that indicate units of meaning, elements of meaning that are lifted from the text. What are the smallest units of meaning that can be derived from the text? The first meaningful element is that there is a boy, and the second meaningful element is something about the size of this boy. The third proposition is one that we can infer that will be useful for us, or may be useful for us, in resolving references in the future. So we know that boys are male. And this is something we probably typically do in order to be able to resolve pronouns such as he or his later on in the text. What this expresses when we posit it at this point is something that is represented in your mind. What is represented in your mind? When you read a little boy, if you stop here, you know that this is a male child we're talking about, because that's what boy means. So the fact that you know is represented in the model by a specific preposition. That's what it means to know. To know is to represent in the mind. So this is a relevant element of meaning that is brought up and included in the text base, so in the list of propositions, as you go through the text. And you may also bring up additional relevant information as you go through the text in order to make local sense or to make local connections. What comes next? The next thing that you represent is, you could be representing this, but I am showing it later because it's easier to show the connections. So I skip to representing the next noun first for ease of representations. Otherwise, I would have to reorder things later. So for ease of representation, I note the next thing to be the ice cream cone, which is a concrete thing. An ice cream cone is one thing, and we have one of these in the text. And this is pink. So number 4 is our ice cream cone, and number 4 is pink. This is an attribute of this preposition. And so we can represent that there is a holding situation. So this is doing the holding. This is the agent of holding. What is one is the boy. And this is the patient. This is being held. The ice cream cone is being held. So by this point, we are representing that there is a holding taking place by a boy to an ice cream cone. But the text doesn't say that there's just holding. It says the boy was holding. So we have to say this is a non-finite and it's a past. Non-finite means that the action was not complete. It doesn't say the boy held the pink ice cream cone. It says it was holding, indicating continuation. This may become relevant, and if we're reading carefully, we're representing this. And we're probably representing this because we probably understand the text. So this is an attribute to be represented about the holding, and this is also an attribute to be represented. This is something that took place in the past. So a little boy was holding a pink ice cream cone is broken down into these elements of meaning that we derive as we go through the text. This is what our mind has by the time we are done reading up to that point. And then we read the rest and we represent that there is a kiosk mentioned and that there is a spatial relationship such that the holding takes place next to the kiosk. So this preposition is a spatial connection in space, linking this state of affairs, the holding situation, with a location indicated by this noun. So this is what we have in our mind after we've done reading this sentence. And if you believe that you have more knowledge about things, or that you've represented more in your mind about this sentence when you're done reading it, you should include those prepositions in your text base. So if you were doing this exercise, now that you've gone through this text and have thought about what is implied, so-called between the lines, which means what is implied but not mentioned in the text, such that you know more by this point, then you should have included it, because the point of the text base is to list all the propositions that become represented in the mind during the reading of this sentence and before you go on to the global integration. So this was my approach, which is very basic. I did not try to elaborate very much, and I constrained myself into not generating many inferences or allowing background knowledge to have a very large effect. Moving on to the next sentence, as we continue reading the text, we see he licked it. That's the next thing we read. So the first thing we have to do is to make sure that we resolve this anaphoric reference by the pronoun that we are talking about the boy. So it refers back to the thing that we represented as our first proposition. And then we have to resolve the other anaphoric reference by this pronoun, and we're resolving it to the cone. We could have resolved it to the kiosk. Now, the question is, where should we resolve? There are syntactical cues, and these are the only ones I'm taking into account now. And the idea is that whatever was the object in the first sentence will carry on in being the object in the second one. This is a syntactic cue. This is not absolute. It could be overridden by semantic cues. So if the object of the first sentence was not something that could be licked, but the next noun was something that could be licked, then we would be connecting this to the second noun based on the meaning of the word at the next step. At this point, because things are such that there is no contradiction, I am just relying on the syntactic cue and postpone the representation of licked, just so I don't have to reorder things. Normally, I would first represent lick, and then I would have the meaning available to help with the resolution of this reference. Now I don't have to do this, and so I say there is licking taking place, and this is the agent who's doing the licking because this has been resolved, and this is the patient who's being licked, and this has been resolved. Again, you could have represented this first with something that might need to be revised based on semantic cues. And this licking also took place in the past, because it says he licked it. Moving on, I represent the next thing that is mentioned, which is the sidewalk. Again, I'm not going through it word by word, as you would do in order to not leave gaps to be filled out later, which is what you would normally do as a reader, just to save a bit of time and space on the slide. You could do it word by word and then going back and filling in as appropriate. So we represent as a proposition that there is a sidewalk involved. And here some people might immediately make the inference that we are in a city of some sort or some kind of relatively urban location. This is where sidewalks are found. You might generate this general knowledge at this point, or you might postpone it for later. I'm keeping things as simple as possible. So I'm just representing the sidewalk and the next thing that is mentioned, which is the sand. So that's another noun that gets its own representation in the text space. Just moving these to the side. The next thing is that the sidewalk turned to sand, I'm representing as a unit of meaning. Note here, I'm not using the same word, I'm using the meaning. I'm doing it on purpose to make sure that it's clear that what goes in the mind isn't so much the words themselves, but it's what they mean. So you're free to put the meaning of the word in the representation if it is exactly accurate. So the sidewalk becomes sand. And this becoming is said to have happened suddenly. So this is an attribute of this. And I'm interpreting this construction and suddenly this happened to be a temporal relationship. The way I'm reading it here, I understand that this is happening after this. So I'm representing the fact that this and then this. So there is a temporal relationship implied by this syntax, and I'm representing it. And then I'm representing that there is a road mentioned, and an ocean wave, and a becoming, that the road becomes an ocean wave. And then I'm interpreting this construction to imply that this becoming, the sidewalk turning to sand, and the road becoming an ocean wave, the way I'm reading it, I am understanding it as taking place simultaneously. This is not obligatory. I suppose some might have interpreted this and to indicate a temporal sequence. So maybe when you read this sentence, you understood that this happened first and this happened second, in which case you would be representing an after relationship here between these two propositions, between these two happenings. But whatever it is, whatever you understood is what is in your mind and should be represented. The point is that as you go through the text, you represent the relationships among these items that you understand are implied by the text. You don't leave things unlinked and hanging, because if you do, then you aren't understanding the structure of the text. Every skilled reader represents the things that they encounter in some sort of relationships. There are spatial relationships, there are temporal relationships, and most importantly, there are causal relationships. And as you read the text and you infer these things, if they're not explicitly mentioned, you are representing them in your mind. So this is in your mind as you read the text. If there's something slightly different in your mind, that is absolutely fine, but something is there. And so the idea is to get you to start thinking in detail. What are the meaning units that you represent as a skilled reader going through the text? And then by processing this idea further, you can begin to imagine what might be missing in someone who's going through a text and not understanding not only what is explicitly stated, but what is implied either by the structure or by the general meaning. Because I'm representing that the two becomings happen at the same time, this implies that the second becoming is also happening after the licking. So it's a sort of an inherited connection, an inherited relationship. If this happens after that, and this happens simultaneously with this, then I also know, which means I represent in my mind, that this also happens after that. So this is my understanding of the text. So far, all of these things are in my mind by the time I'm done reading the second sentence. So I'm going to skip most sentences now because this would take way too long to go through every word. And I'm going on to the last critical sentence, which states in the next commercial, it was the turn of a laundry detergent to work its magic. Let's work directly with this sentence. Let's just omit all the intermediate text for this presentation. So the first thing we represent here is the noun, the commercial, and when we see the word commercial, our mind immediately goes to the fact that it must be on TV. It doesn't have to be. It's possible to see commercials on your phone or in a movie theater. Whatever comes to your mind, you represent here. If it says in the next commercial and your mind doesn't go to any specific kind of commercial or a medium for it, then you don't represent anything. In my mind, this word made me think that someone is watching television. So I'm representing it. And then I represent that there is a next commercial because that's mentioned in the text. So this is an attribute of that. And I'm leaving it red because I have nothing to connect it to. There hasn't been any mention of any previous commercials here. So as I'm reading this statement, this is left hanging. I have no surface cues by which I could connect this to something. So it just stays there and is a source of tension. And I'm going to represent the next things before I move on to the next step. Not because I think that someone processes all of the sentences before making sense. This is definitely not true. So the two stages of the construction integration model are not in strict sequence over the whole text. You don't start integrating the text after you're done reading the whole thing. That would make no sense. You're continuously involved and engaged at both levels. But because now I'm presenting two different things, for simplicity, I'm going to go through the rest of the text base before I go on to illustrate the integration phase. In actual reading of the text, you would be simultaneously constructing the text base on the surface level and trying to integrate at the global level all the time. So the next thing that is mentioned is a laundry detergent. You could represent a detergent and laundry as an attribute of it. I just tend to think of it as one thing. So I'm representing it as one preposition. And what the text says is that it was the turn of this thing. It is its turn. Okay, it was somebody else's turn before. And then magic is mentioned. It's a noun. It gets its own preposition. And we find that the laundry detergent works its magic. So the laundry detergent does some sort of magic. And that completes the representation of the minimal meanings based on the surface elements of the text, along with minimal inferences made while reading them, some based on background knowledge and some having to do with connecting, with specifying relationships, relational propositions among other elements. And so moving on to the next phase of integration, which I repeat, doesn't wait until you're done reading a paragraph in order to take place. It also happens all the time on the basis of the current text base. And that's how comprehension monitoring can direct you to revise your text base if necessary. So let's see what the situation model looks like when we begin to build it based on this text base. The first thing that's represented is that there is a boy, a little boy, and then there's a pink ice cream cone, and these are connected by a holding action or situation with its attributes and a spatial relationship. So this represents the first sentence in a kind of macro structure. Then the boy licks the ice cream, so these are connected in two ways. The boy holds the ice cream and the boy licks the ice cream. This is also in the past. And then two things happen. This becomes sand and this becomes ocean wave. These happen simultaneously, suddenly, and after the licking. So that's my representation of everything that happened in the first two sentences. This is the macro structure of the text, including two sentences. And then I'm skipping the intermediate sentences and going on to the last one. In order for everything to connect, I have to make the inference that everything happens or exists within a TV commercial. I'm not representing the thing about the detergent and the magic. I'm just representing here the part of the structure that concerns the first couple of sentences. So the point is that comprehension and monitoring kicks in because of that hanging next. And then I have to infer that everything takes place in a commercial because of that hanging next for the whole text to make sense, to be coherent globally. And by making that inference, then everything fits. So this is the actual macro structure of the first two sentences, taking into account the last sentence. And this can only happen in the integration phase that results in a situation model in which your mind represents these things as existing and happening in a commercial. Again, the point of this exercise is not to be obsessive about the notation or the formulation. And it's not about saying that this is the exactly right way to represent things or the exact correct things to represent. Different readers may have different or at least slightly different interpretations of the same text based on their own background and abilities. And different presentations of this model and how it's supposed to work may present things a little differently in terms of notation or in terms of when some of these take place. And I have also taken the liberty of changing the order a little bit in order to not go back and forth and fill in prepositions in the way I constructed the text base. The point of all this is just to think of what must be taking place in the mind during reading of a text, such that in the end, you have a representation in the mind of the situation that is described in the text as you interpret it, such that it is globally coherent. And this is what's in your mind, and this is what you can remember. Things that aren't connected a lot, like that these happened suddenly perhaps, or that these were simultaneous, or exactly what turned into what, things that have fewer connections, that are less central to the network that you represent, are more likely to be forgotten. And that explains why we tend to see some things in the text as details. They're details in the sense that they're not richly connected, therefore their activation is not strongly supported, and that makes them weaker and more prone to be forgotten. This is also the knowledge in your mind that permits you in the future to answer any questions about the text, because this is all you know about the text. So this is the representation of what you understood, or actually what I understood. So if you ask me a question about the text, the only thing I have to refer to for answering it is go into what I've represented in my mind, go into my situation model, look up the relevant information, the relations that I have represented, what I have inferred, having completely forgotten about the surface of the sentences themselves, and then try to find the answer in this macro structure that I have created. So if I'm not answering comprehension questions correctly, and if you know that I don't have an expressive problem in my language, then you must infer that my situation model, what I've represented in my mind based on the text, is somehow deficient. And it may be that I haven't represented, or I have forgotten entities, I have forgotten propositions, units of meaning, or I have forgotten relationships, or I haven't correctly represented relationships, or I haven't made the appropriate inferences for properly connecting these propositions. So all of these things need to be looked into. And understanding the construction integration model and how this leads to an internal representation called a situation model helps us think more deeply about comprehension, as well as the particular weaknesses that may be observed in those who have difficulty understanding texts.